The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the American environmental activist, attorney, and author. You are the chairman of Children's Health Defense, whose mission is to end the epidemic of children's chronic health conditions by working aggressively to eliminate harmful exposures, hold those responsible accountable, and establish safeguards. Your written articles have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Rolling Stone magazine. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, you have contradicted the mainstream media and are here today to discuss the vaccine agenda, global lockdown consequences, the implications of 5G, and the roles of Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates. Robert, welcome to London Real.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Great having you here. I just first wanted to announce that we are streaming now on our new Digital Freedom platform, which is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and it's available exclusively on our website at londonreal.tv. Robert, I pledge to you and everyone watching us that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anyone in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at londonreal.tv/Kennedy, thanks to the generous donations of over 25,000 people around the world, also known as the London Real Army. For anyone wanting to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom platform, they can visit londonreal.tv/freedom to donate and fight with us on the front lines to protect our human rights. Here at London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Robert, I'm excited to have you here today. You know, I wanted to start and talk about something that you're really familiar with, and that is vaccines. In the UK, we keep hearing vaccines. In America, we hear vaccines, and it feels like we're being told that this is the only way we can return to normalcy, the only way we can go back to work. And I had a guest yesterday, and we streamed to 1 million people watch this. It was the largest live stream of a conversation in human history. And he said, Brian, there's something called a problem, reaction, solution. You have a problem, there's a public reaction, and then there's a solution. And it feels like we're kind of all being herded toward this vaccine, and now it's being rushed. And I'm just wondering, what is your take on all of this? Do you think it's something we should proceed with caution? Do you think there are pros and cons of a potential vaccine? Or just curious what your take is on kind of the entire situation.
Well, I agree with first of all, let me apologize for my voice, Brian, which should improve as we talk. I had a very, very strong voice till I was 42 years old, and then I got a disease called spasmodic dystonia, which is a neurological disease, and it makes my voice break up like this. But usually after I talk for a while, it gets better, I hope. My kind of impression about what's happening now is colored by my work on vaccines over the past 15 years. And I want to start, I'm an attorney. I'm primarily an environmental attorney. I sue polluters. I run one of the biggest and one of the founders of the biggest water protection group in the world, which is the Waterkeeper. We have 350 waterkeepers on waterways, operating patrol boats on waterways in 46 countries. We have one in London on the Thames Riverkeeper, and all over the world, and they patrol those waterways, they track down polluters, and we litigate against them. And that's kind of how my pathway was into this issue, which I got dragged kicking and screaming into the vaccine issue. But, and I got brought in because of the mercury issue. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of mercury in American vaccines. I was suing coal burning power plants all over North America and Canada and the United States for discharging mercury into the air, which was then getting into the water, and it was contaminating the fish. In 2003, FDA released a report that showed that every freshwater fish in America had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. So we were litigating, many of the waterkeepers were litigating against coal burning power plants and cement kilns in many of our states and several of the provinces of Canada. And I was going around managing the litigation and also working on legislation and giving speeches. And almost everywhere I spoke, there would be women in the audience who would come up to me afterwards, and it turned out they were the mothers of intellectually disabled kids, and they believed that their children had been injured from mercury and vaccines. And they would say to me, kind of in a mildly scolding but very respectful way, if you're genuinely interested in mercury contamination and children, exposures to children, you need to look at the mercury in vaccines. It's not something that I wanted to do. Eventually, one of these mothers came to my house, a psychologist named Sarah Bridges. Her son had been injured by vaccines, by mercury vaccines. He'd actually, the vaccine court, the federal vaccine court had recognized that he got autism from vaccines. His name is Porter Bridges. And they gave him a $20 million lifetime reward, including paying for all of his schooling and autism treatment and training and this kind of thing. She didn't want the same thing to happen to other children. She came to me, she had a pile of scientific studies that was 18 inches deep. She put them on my front porch in Cape Cod in the summer of 2005. And she told me, I'm not leaving here till you read these. I'm very comfortable reading science. I've brought over 500 successful legal actions during my career, almost all on environmental issues. Almost all of them included some kind of scientific controversy. So I need to be able to read science, to understand it and dissect it, and to read it critically. And I started reading these studies, and before I was 6 inches down in that pile, I was already astonished by the huge delta between what the public health agencies were telling us about mercury in vaccines and vaccine safety in general, and what the actual published peer-reviewed science was saying about that issue. And I began doing what I always would do in those cases when I didn't understand something. I started calling the regulators and the people who made those decisions. And because my family has been on the spear tip of the movement for rights and treatments for people with intellectual disabilities for generations, for 80 years, I had access to all of those people, and they would pick up the phone. And I talked to Anthony Fauci, and I talked to Francis Collins, and I talked to Mary McCormick, who was the head of the Institute of Medicine, and Kathleen Stratton, and Paul Offit, and all the people who were kind of at the forefront of getting us all to use vaccines. And I realized very early on during those conversations that they were not, number one, were not conversant with the science, and number two, in many cases, were simply lying about it. And that took me down this rabbit hole where 15 years later, this is one of the central preoccupations of my life and my career. I'm not anti-vaccine. I've been fighting against mercury in fish, to get the mercury out of the fish for 37 years. Nobody calls me anti-fish. If somebody comes up with a vaccine for COVID or anything else that actually does what it promises to do, which is to avert disease without side effects, without significant side effects, then I would totally support that. The problem is that we don't know of any vaccine that actually does that. And the reason we don't know is because vaccines are not safety tested. So of the 72 vaccines that are now mandated for American children in our country. Not a single one has ever been tested against an inert placebo. And that means that if you don't test it in placebo tests, like every other medicine, it's not science, it's marketing. And the reason the vaccines don't have to be safety tested is an artifact of CDC's legacy as the Public Health Service, which was its predecessor agency. The Public Health Service was a quasi-military agency, which is why people at CDC have military ranks like Surgeon General, et cetera. And the vaccine program was initially conceived and launched as a national security defense against biological attacks on our country. So the Pentagon and the Public Health Service wanted to make sure, the regulators wanted to make sure that if the Russians attacked us with anthrax or some other biological agent, that we would be able to quickly fabricate a vaccine and develop it and then deploy it to 200 million Americans without regulatory impediments. So they said, if we call it a medicine, you have to safety test medicines. And that usually takes about 5 years because there are many injuries that occur, cancers and autoimmune diseases that occur when you start messing with the immune system that have long diagnostic horizons that you won't see for many, many years. So normally medicines are tested for 5 years in double-blind placebo tests. They said, we don't want to do that. But if we call it a medicine, we have to do that. So we will call it something else. We're going to call it a biologic. And then we're going to exempt biologics from safety testing. So we now, and then, you know, the next kind of major historical step that happened is that in 1986, Congress gave vaccine makers blanket immunity from liability. And let me just give you a little background on that, Brian. I had 3 vaccines when I was a kid. I was born in 1954. Today's kids get 72 doses, and it changed. The big change happened in 1986 because in the early 80s we started using a diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine called DTP vaccine. It's no longer used in the United States or Europe. We still give it to African kids. It was causing horrendous brain damage in children and killing a lot of children. Vaccine companies, Wyeth said for every dollar it was making on that vaccine, it was losing 20 in lawsuits, in damaged lawsuits. And Wyeth went to Congress with the other vaccine makers, and they were the biggest #1 contributor to lobbying. And they told Congress, we're going to stop making vaccines unless you give it, because they cannot be safely made. They said, we can't make the DTP safety. A certain number of people are going to get injured, are going to get killed. No matter what we do, we cannot make it safely. And we're going to stop making them all together, all vaccines, if you don't give us immunity from liability. So Congress, Democratic Congress, and Republican President Ronald Reagan signed that bill into law in 1986. Suddenly, the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, looked around and they said, holy cow, now we have a product that you don't have to safety test them. That's a huge cost saving because that usually costs $100 million minimum. You don't have to, and there's no liability at the end, even if you injure people, which means there's no incentive to make it safe. But it also saves the industry. The biggest cost for every other medicine are liability suits when they injure people. And so the industry says, here's something, the 2 biggest costs are now eliminated. And then the third cost, which is advertising and marketing, is also eliminated because this product is going to be mandated to the 78 million kids. And there's very, very high margins. The government is going to buy half those vaccines for poor children. It's like the dream product. If you could get your vaccine onto the schedule, onto the CDC's mandatory schedule, it's worth about $1 billion in profit to your company for every year for every vaccine you can get on that schedule. So there was a gold rush at the CDC to put new vaccines on the schedule. And we went from the 3 vaccines that I have a kid to the 72 doses today. And that big change began in 1989. Something else happened that year in 89. We started seeing an epidemic of childhood chronic diseases. So autism in my generation is 1 in 10,000. And still in my generation, there is, the epidemic is real because you don't see 66-year-old men walking around the mall with football helmets, in diapers, nonverbal, non-toilet trained, stimming, headbanging. My family started Special Olympics. I was working with intellectual disabled kids and adults my entire life. And I never saw an adult like that. And I didn't see kids like that when I was little. We went from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 34 kids today, and 1 in every 22 boys. Food allergies went from 1 in about 1,200 in my generation to about 1 in 12 today. We saw these epidemics, all these different diseases, 3 categories, neurodevelopmental diseases, all beginning in 1989. In fact, Congress told EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic started. And the EPA scientists came back and said it's a red line, 1989. That's the year they changed the vaccine schedule. The neurodevelopmental disorders that we didn't know. I don't know how old you are, Brian, but when I was a kid, I didn't know anybody who had these diseases: ADD, ADHD, speech delay, tics, narcolepsy. SIDS appeared suddenly with the DTP vaccine. Tourette's syndrome, tics, ASD, autism, all of them exploded beginning in 1989. The allergies, peanut allergies, which we know you can induce somebody to have a peanut allergy by giving them the aluminum adjuvant that is contained now in 60% of our vaccines and a peanut protein. If you give them a Timothy weed protein, they'll have a Timothy weed outbreak, Timothy weed allergy, etc.
So you're saying all of these new ailments and the high frequency of those is all highly correlated with the introduction of all these new vaccines. Not only
to the timing, and then also the autoimmune diseases, so rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile diabetes, fibromyalgia, all of these, Guillain-Barré, all these injuries that began in 89. And it's not just that there's a time correlation. There is also, if you look at the list of all those diseases, about 420 diseases that suddenly became epidemic in 1989, every one of those diseases appears on 2 lists. One of them are the list of diseases that became epidemic in 89. 2, they're on the manufacturer's inserts for those vaccines. 420 diseases, and the manufacturer only puts them on that insert if FDA believes that there's a high likelihood that they're causing that disease. And the reason they're on those inserts is because the only way that you can sue a vaccine company under the Vaccine Act is if they knew of an injury that is caused by the vaccine and they failed to list it on their inserts. All of those injuries, including autism, are listed on manufacturers' inserts. They'll tell you in every other context it doesn't happen, there's no connection. And in the one context where they have to be honest, they're disclosing that. And if you look at their economics now, Brian.
Robert, I gotta stop you really quick. This is mind-boggling what you're telling me. And I mean, I went to MIT. I understand the value and necessity of a double-blind study in any situation. I can't believe that the vaccines aren't tested. And this lack of liability, I've heard it mentioned before because that's the only way it would make economic sense for these big pharma companies to make vaccines. But everything you're saying to me is making perfect logical sense. And yet it blows my mind that no one's talking about it. How come no one's talking about this?
Well, nobody's talking about it because of the control that the pharmaceutical industry exercises over the political leaders. All of the all of the institutions in a democracy in Europe, the United States, Australia, that were set up in order to protect vulnerable little children from greedy corporations have been neutralized. So the agencies that are supposed to protect us from and protect our children from, from bad products have been completely co-opted. They're what you call captive agencies, and that's done through a number of mechanisms. The European Health Agency, 50% of its budget comes from Pharma. The CDC is now one of the biggest vaccine makers in the world, or sellers in the world, distributors. The CDC distributes $4.9 billion worth of vaccines a year, so about half of its budget goes to distributing vaccines, and basically it is integrated with the industry, FDA.
So it has a conflict of interest, the CDC, by nature.
Conflict. Also, the CDC, FDA, and NIH all own vaccine patents.
How is that possible? That
every vial of Gardasil that is sold, money goes to NIH, and those agencies are making tens of millions of dollars a year selling the vaccines they're supposed to be regulating. FDA gets 50% of its budget from pharmaceutical companies.
How is that possible? Isn't it
the World Health Organization gets over 50% of its budget from pharmaceutical companies, if from industry, let's put it that way. If you include Bill Gates, it's even more than that, which is 10% of one out of every $10 comes from Gates, who is the biggest vaccine producer and maker in the world. Oh,
the FDA always seems like
so you have a conflict with the agencies. You then have Congress has been bought off because pharmaceutical companies spend double what the next biggest lobbyist spends on Congress. But most importantly is the press. The pharmaceutical industry in the United States, it used to be illegal for them to advertise pharmaceuticals on TV like it is in every other country in the world except for New Zealand.
Including the UK, you don't see that. I mean, Robert, when I go to America, I'm shocked. There's a 2-minute ad for some drug I've never heard of. It's colorful. There are models. They're outdoors, and it's on and on and on, and it's shocking.
Happy people.
Yeah, it's always.
And what that does is it not only allows them to push their products through the marketplace, but it also allows them to control content on the network news. Most of those, the highest saturation of those advertisements are on the network news. Roger Ailes, who founded Fox News and who had a relative who was vaccine injured and knew what was happening. And I had I had a close relationship, very strange relationship with Roger Ailes. I spent 2 months with him in a tent when I was 18 years old in Africa. And he always, although our politics were diametrically opposed, he always was well disposed, and he would always put me on his network, to argue my environmental issues. I went to him with a documentary that we had just made on mercury and vaccines, and he was utterly convinced by it. But he said, "I cannot put you on my network." He said, "In fact, I would be forced to fire any of my hosts who allowed you to talk about this on TV." And he said, "If I allowed you on, I didn't fire the host, I would have a call from Rupert within 10 minutes. Rupert Murdoch owns one of the biggest vaccine company in Australia. His family, has been deeply immersed in that industry for generations, and he has partnerships with Glaxo and with all the big vaccine makers. Oh, he is one of the press enforcers worldwide. But in our country, Roger Ailes told me, Roger Ailes said during non-election years, during certain times of the year, 70% of my advertising revenues from my news station, from my evening news broadcast, comes from Pharma." And he said, typically there's about 22 ads on the evening news, and 17 of those are pharmaceutical ads. And there's no way, Anderson Cooper is sponsored by Pfizer. Erin Burnett is sponsored by Pfizer. The NBC Nightly News is sponsored by Merck. That's why you see them constantly pushing flu shots, measles shots, alarming people about diseases and, about the horrendous threat of infectious diseases, and never allowing any discussion about vaccine side effects on any of those networks. It's completely forbidden. And that gestalt has infiltrated the entire, let's say, media industry in our country. I haven't been allowed to publish an editorial since 2008. As you pointed out at the beginning of this show, I used to regularly publish. I had to deal with the New York Times at one point where they wanted an editorial from me every 6 months, which is the maximum amount that anybody can put an editorial on there. So now they won't let me put an editorial on about anything, because they need to discredit me about this issue. They need to shut down debate. They need to call me an anti-vaxxer, which I'm not, because that marginalizes me. It discredits me. It makes them say he is that category, therefore he is dangerous. We need to protect the public from dangerous thoughts, and therefore it is justifiable to allow people to go on TV to write editorials condemning him and not allowing him to defend himself. When a couple of my family members a year or so ago attacked me in Politico, and by the way, my family, I grew up, being encouraged by my mom and dad to have heated arguments. People ask me, are you mad at your family? And my attitude is, I don't care if people argue with me.
Was that it?
I love my family and we argue. That's what we do. I took a public position. They took a public position against me. That's fine. But it's the fault of Politico that they wouldn't even let me write a letter to the editor, 200 words, defending myself against a 3,000 word attack on me. And no news organization will even allow me to print a letter to the editor, much less an editorial. I'm not allowed to go on TV. I can't go. I can tell you, Bill Maher's allowed me on, and Tucker Carlson's allowed me on twice. Nobody else will allow me on the network news because it's owned by Pharma. And what that does is it reinforces the entire kind of political control. Because any politician who, expresses even, any kind of dissent against the orthodoxies on this issue, their careers are immediately destroyed.
Because they won't have the funding. They won't have any political funding.
They can't do it.
Right.
They cannot do it.
And
keep their careers.
And you said there was that open letter from a few members of the Kennedy family that kind of was against you. But you said on the Kennedy compound, it was encouraged at dinner to constantly debate and argue. And you said your dad would have you guys kind of take different points of view. And that's kind of the normal way it was with Kennedys to debate.
Yeah, that's the way. And I raised my kids the same way. But my father would throw out a topic. I remember him saying, asking us to debate when we were little kids. I think my sister was probably 15 or 16, and I was 13 or 14. Should we take LSD? Should LSD be illegal? Should we be in the Vietnam War? Should we, what should we do about Vietnam? What should we, our ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, is that something we should build more of? And is Castro a freedom fighter or is he a tyrant? And he would ask us to take different views on that. My grandfather did the same thing to his children. My grandfather hated communism. And the most famous communist philosopher of that generation was Harold Lasky, who taught at the London School of Economics. And my grandfather made all of his kids go over there and study under him because he wanted them to be exposed to a wide range of views and to be able to develop on their own points of views and opinions about things, and then to defend those things. He sent them to see Franco's dictatorship. He sent them to see Hitler. He made sure they would all work as journalists. So they would go to see what it was like to live under Mussolini, what it was like to live in Hitler's Germany and Franco and then to go to Africa and Latin America and elsewhere and see, what the basis for other people's opinions, and then to be able to argue about it and defend it. So, I grew up in that milieu.
Right.
And people, it's almost like when people say, well, did this destroy your family? I'm like, are you out of your mind? This is what we do. This is how we talk to each other. And of course, I made a choice to go public on this. They have different opinion. They're entitled to defend that. And, they did it in a loving way. They were dead wrong, but they did it, it wasn't something that would wreck my relationship with them.
Right. All right. So now everything you said is fascinating. Now take it now with the lens of what's happening now, where we've got, Anthony Fauci on stage next to Donald Trump, obviously doing these nightly briefings. We've now had the lockdown period. And now, as I said in the introduction, it seems like everyone's pushing this vaccine agenda, including Fauci. What do you see going on behind the scenes? Because you spent a long period of your life researching all of the forces.
Let me just make one other point about the economic drivers for this industry. If you look at the vaccine industry, when I was a kid, it was about a $287 million industry. Nobody was making huge money on it. Today, it's a $60 billion industry, and it is the growth potential for these companies because of all the reasons that I outlined. It has a much, you can't sue them. So, they can just, and it's mandated. And so that, every year there's about 273 vaccines in the pipeline. There's 72 already on the schedule, 273 in the pipeline for the future, and that are in the regulatory process already to get mandated for it. And there's really no end in sight. But if you look, so now it's a $60 billion industry. The industry, the pharmaceutical opportunities for treating injuries caused by vaccines dwarf the revenues from the vaccine industry itself. So if you look at the 20 biggest blockbuster drugs that are now produced, like, Keytruda or whatever, by those 4 companies, almost all of them are to treat diseases that are listed as vaccine injuries on their own vaccine inserts. Oh, they're making $500 billion a year selling our kids the Adderall, the Ritalin, the Concerta, the albuterol inhalers, the asthma treatments, the diabetes treatments, the seizure treatments, the rheumatoid arthritis treatments. And if you treat measles, what happens when you get measles? It's a rash. It was killing 1 out of every 500,000 Americans in 1963, the year that, imagine that, 1 in 500,000 Americans, according to CDC. If you actually got the measles, your chance of dying was 1 in 10,000. And they're talking about now COVID maybe killing 1 in 100 or 2 in 100. This is 1 in 10,000. This was not a serious disease. And if you got that in 1963 when they did so if you got measles, what happened? The cure, you stayed a week home, and the cure was vitamin D and chicken soup, 2 things that cannot be patented. What if you get epilepsy or seizure disorder from getting an MMR? Now you have a lifetime commitment to those pharmaceutical companies. And if you get ADD, ADHD, if you're on Ritalin for the rest of your life, on Adderall, on diabetes medicine, that is a lifetime of unlimited revenues for that company. Oh, this is a very, very attractive business model for those companies, and they know it. And I can tell you that because I would have never believed it, and I would have said somebody If somebody said that to me, I'd say, oh, they're just a conspiracy theorist and they're a cynic and a skeptic. Of course they don't know, but yeah, they do. And, I'm suing them on it. So I'm in Merck's wheelhouse now. I'm doing a discovery on them, and it's very clear they know exactly what's happening, and they've made a cold calculation. Listen, the 4 companies that make all 72 of those vaccines, which is Sanofi, Merck, Glaxo, and Pfizer. Every one of those companies is a convicted felon. Over the past 10 years, those 4 companies have paid $35 billion in damages, in penalties, in criminal and civil penalties, for lying to regulators, defrauding regulators, falsifying science, bribing, blackmailing doctors, involved in really sophisticated criminal activity at a very, very high level, for killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. Merck's blockbuster drug Vioxx before Gardasil. Merck's blockbuster drug was Vioxx. Merck killed between 120,000 and 500,000 Americans deliberately. By deliberately, I mean knowingly. They didn't say we want to kill these people. They did say, because we have their spreadsheets from their bean counters, we got them in discovery. This is how many people are going to die if we market this drug the way we want to. And we will still make more money, even if we have to pay them all off.
Robert, how do they sleep at night? How do these people sleep at night? I mean,
well, you know what Upton Sinclair said? It's almost impossible for you to convince a man of a fact if the existence of that fact is going to diminish his salary. Oh, we all have a capacity to interpret the world and interpret an event in a way that allows us to tell ourselves, well, we are good people. And what we're doing, and we judge ourselves on our intentions rather than our actions a lot of the time. Right. And I think that those companies have a particularly acute capacity for that, particular, I don't know if you'd call it a defect or virtue, but there's a statistical, there's a statistical flaw that is known as by statisticians and epidemiologists as confirmation bias. And what that means is that you tend to have a bias that hides from you facts that are contrary to your worldview. And it's a biological impulse. You can see where it came from, that if you were, when in the 20,000 generations that we were wandering the African savannah as, part of little warring groups, we had to really believe that all the people we were with were right and everybody else in the world was wrong. So it's one of the features of tribalism, and we all have that capacity. The problem is when a guy who is as powerful as Bill Gates has that capacity to see himself as a good man and to see all of his intentions as pure, and then not see that the DTP vaccine that he's giving to every child in Africa is killing 10 kids. It kills children, vaccinated kids, at 10 times the rate as unvaccinated kids will die. And he has in his hands scientific studies by the highest scientific authorities in the world that says that vaccine is killing more children than diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis combined ever did. And that he's giving mercury vaccines to every kid in Africa when we've banned them in the United States because we know that they cause brain damage, because the Institute of Medicine said that they're dangerous and they should not be given to human beings. And yet he's giving them to every kid in Africa. Somehow under his watch, that WHO, which he runs, chemically castrated 1 million Kenyan women with a hormone that was put in tetanus vaccines deliberately and given deliberately. And I'm sure in Gates's mind, he thinks that there was a good intention behind that. maybe reducing population and, reducing the burden on ecosystems and all those, which I think is an important consideration. But, when you get that powerful, you need to look at the moral implications and the human rights implications and the civil rights implications of everything that you do. These people are not just ants that you can experiment with.
Right. But in his mind,
every one of them has a value that is as great, a value to God that is as great as Bill Gates' value, even though they don't have any money.
I think he's convincing himself that he's eradicating these diseases for the planet forever. And like you said, along the way, some collateral damage is maybe justified because it's difficult to do that. So I'm guessing that's what he's doing. How does a man like Bill Gates end up being the leading medical authority in the world? And how does he exert his authority? And is this COVID-19 pandemic playing right into his hands? How do you see that?
Well, yeah, I mean, and then the COVID vaccine, well, clearly, the direct answer to your question is that he's leveraged, he's the second richest man in the world, probably the second or third richest man in history. And he's leveraged that money he pays 10%, one out of every $10 that goes to WHO is his money. And that marginal 10% gives him the capacity to control 100% of the WHO's agenda. CEPI, Gavi, all of these institutions that really dictate global health policies and control in many aspects, in varying aspects, the lives and the health of 7 billion human beings who live on the planet. And he now has, he has got himself the capacity to dictate those policies. So, I think it's good that he's now on TV, that he made a decision to sort of come out from behind the curtain and defend his position, because I think a lot of people that it allowed people to focus and realize that there's a single man making these decisions for all of us. And that, what we believed, because before he started doing this, you had all of these trusted authorities. You had Anderson Cooper saying it's really important. You had Aaron Burnett and Lester Holt, and you had Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins and all of these people that we kind of trust saying the same thing. And you're thinking to yourself, well, that must be the truth if so many smart, trustworthy people are saying it. But now I think people are understanding that this is an agenda. It's an agenda that is driven by one man overwhelmingly, and that there's a lot of people, fellow travelers, who are, part of the orthodoxy because they are bought into it in different ways. And I think it allows people to see, to now express their skepticism about it in ways that they could not before.
And one of those is Anthony Fauci as well. How does Fauci...
Anthony Fauci has a long checkered history of lying and of playing, of putting his own ambition and putting the vaccine program in particular in front of public health. And I'll just tell you one story, but I know many things about Anthony Fauci. But Anthony Fauci, there was a group of scientists led by Frank Ruscetti in the mid 80s that discovered, and then one of those scientists was Judy Mikovits. And I just did the introduction for her book, which is called Plague, which is largely written about this episode. This was the team that had isolated HIV and connected it with the AIDS epidemic, and said it can cause AIDS. It doesn't have to, but it can. And they had been the first to reproduce the work of a French scientist named Luc Montagnier, who got the Nobel Prize for that discovery. But they had.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.